Here's a story about the worldview of a little child and the difficult moral question she raises during the story session with her father. In the evenings and for Saturday naps like today's, Jack told his daughter Jo a story out of his head. This custom began when she was 2, was itself now nearly 2 years old, and his head felt empty. His head felt empty means he was not able to come up with any idea as to what kind of story to tell her. Or, in other words, you can say that he was running short of ideas. Each new story was a slight variation of a basic tale, a small creature usually named Roger, Roger Fish, Roger Squirrel, Roger Chipmunk, had some problem and went with it to the wise old owl. The owl told him to go to the wizard, and the wizard performed a magic spell that solved the problem, demanding in payment a number of pennies greater than the number that Roger Creature had, but in the same breath directing the animal to a place where the extra pennies could be found. Then Roger was so happy. He played many games with other creatures and went home to his mother just in time to hear the train whistle that brought his daddy home from Boston. Jack described their supper, and the story was over. Working his way through the scheme was specially tiring on Saturday because Joe never fell asleep in naps anymore, and knowing this made the ride seem futile. The little girl, not so little anymore, the bumps her feet made under the covers, were halfway down the bed, their big double bed that they let her be in for naps and when she was sick, had at last arranged herself, and from the way her fat face deep in the pillow shone in the sunlight, sifting through the drawn shades, it did not seem fantastic that some magic would occur and she would take her nap like an infant of 2. Her brother Bobby was 2 and already asleep with his bottle. Jack asked, "Who shall the story be about today?" The custom of storytelling was especially tiring on Saturdays because Jo was growing up. She was not an infant anymore, so she never fell asleep in naps the way she used to when she was an infant. And knowing this made this custom seem futile. Futile means useless, worthless, pointless. The little girl was not so little anymore. In this paragraph, the author is trying to tell us that in spite of the fact that Jack very well knew that Joe was not going to fall asleep even after telling her the story, he was conscious of his duties as a father and asked her whom shall the story be about today. Joe squeezed her eyes shut and smiled to be thinking she was thinking. Her eyes opened, her mother's blue. "Skunk," she said firmly. "A new animal. They must talk about skunks at nursery school." Having a fresh hero momentarily stirred Jack to creative enthusiasm. Skunk or a polecat is a small black and white North American animal, and it produces a strong and pleasant smell to defend itself when it is attacked. Hearing about a new animal, skunk, brought back the enthusiasm in Jack, and he started off with the story. "All right," he said. "Once upon a time, in the deep dark woods, there was a tiny little creature by the name of Roger Skunk. and he smelled very bad. Yes, Joe said. He smelled so bad that none of the other little woodland creatures would play with him. Joe looked at him solemnly. She hadn't foreseen this. Whenever he would go out to play, Jack continued, remembering certain humiliations of his own childhood, all of the other tiny animals would cry. Oh, here comes Roger Stinky Skunk. And they would run away, and Roger Skunk would stand there all alone, and two little round tears would fall from his eyes. The corners of Joe's mouth drooped down, and her lower lip bent forward as he traced with a forefinger along the side of her nose the course of one of Roger Skunk's tears. Joe was feeling bad for Roger Skunk. She seemed to share his pleasure and pain, and so complete was her identification that the mention of tears in Roger Skunk's eyes brought tears in her eyes too. Her mouth drooped down and her lower lip bent forward, and Jack's finger could trace the course of a tear along the side of her nose. Won't he see the owl? She asked in a high and faintly roughened voice. Sitting on the bed beside her, Jack felt the covers tug as her legs switched tensely. He was pleased with this moment. He was telling her something true, something she must know, and had no wish to hurry on. But downstairs a chair scraped, and he realized he must get down to help Claire paint the living room woodwork. Jack was happy that he was telling Jo something true, something she must know, and had no wish whatsoever to hurry on. But just then, at that very moment, a chair scraped downstairs, and he realized that he must get down to help his wife Claire to paint the woodwork in the living room. But still he continued with the story. The word scrape means a sound made by rubbing against a rough surface. Well, he walked along very sadly and came to a very big tree, and in the tip top of the tree was an enormous wise old owl. Good, Mr. Owl, Roger Skunk said. All the other little animals run away from me because I smell so bad. So you do, the owl said, very, very bad. What can I do? Roger Skunk said, and he cried very hard. The wizard, Joe shouted, and sat right up, and a little golden book spilled from the bed. Because the plot of every story was the same, Joe very well knew that Owl is going to tell him to go to the wizard. So before Jack could say anything further, she shouted, "The wizard, the wizard." Now, Joe, Daddy's telling the story. Do you want to tell Daddy the story? No, you me. Then lie down and be sleepy. Her head relapsed onto the pillow and she said, "Out of your head." Well, the owl thought and thought. At last he said, "Why don't you go see the wizard?" "Daddy, what?" "Our magic spells are real. This was a new phase, just this last month, a reality phase." When he told her spiders eat bugs, she turned to her mother and asked, "Do they really?" And when Claire told her God was in the sky and all around them, she turned to her father and insisted, with a sly yet eager smile, "Is he really?" In this paragraph, the author is trying to stress the point that when kids are small, they usually agree to whatever the parents say. But when they start growing up, they tend to become more curious and they start questioning. They enter a new phase that is a reality phase. They're real in stories, Jack answered curtly. She had made him miss a beat in the narrative. Made him miss a beat in the narrative means that Joe, by interrupting him and asking him question in the middle of the story, made him stop momentarily while narrating the story. The owl said, "Go through the dark woods, under the apple trees, into the swamp, over the creek." What's a creek? A little river. Over the creek, and there will be the wizard's house. And that's the way Roger Skunk went. And pretty soon he came to a little white house, and he rapped on the door. Jack rapped on the window sill, and under the covers, Joe's tall figure clenched into an infantile thrill. And then a tiny little old man came out, with a long white beard and a pointed blue hat, and said, "Hey, what's this? What you want? You smell awful." The wizard's voice was one of Jack's own favorite effects. He did it by scrunching up his face and somehow whining through his eyes, which felt for the interval roomy. He felt being an old man suited him. "I know it," Roger Skunk said, "and all the little animals run away from me. The enormous wise owl said you could help me." "Well, maybe. Come on in. Don't get too close." Now inside Joe, there were all these magic things, all jumbled together in a big dusty heap, because the wizard did not have any cleaning lady. Why? Why? Because he was a wizard and a very old man. Will he die? No, wizards don't die. Well, he rummaged around and found an old stick called a magic wand and asked Roger Skunk what he wanted to smell like. Roger thought and said roses. "Yes, good," Joe said smugly. Jack fixed her with a trance-like gaze and chanted in the wizard's elderly, irritable voice, "Abracadabra, hocus poo, Roger Skunk, how do you do? Roses, posies, pull an ear, Roger Skunk, you never fear. Bingo!" He paused as a rapt expression widened out from his daughter's nostrils, forcing her eyebrows up and her lower lip down in a wide, noiseless grin, an expression in which Jack was startled to recognize his wife feigning pleasure at cocktail parties. And all of a sudden he whispered, the whole inside of the wizard's house was full of the smell of roses. "Roses!" Roger Fish cried, and the wizard said, very cranky, "That will be 7 pennies." "Daddy!" "What?" "Roger Skunk, you said Roger Fish." "Yes, Skunk." "You said Roger Fish. Wasn't that silly?" "Very silly of your stupid old daddy." "Where was I?" "Well, you know about the pennies." "Say it." "Okay," Roger Skunk said, "but all I have is 4 pennies." And he began to cry. Joe made the crying face again, but this time without a trace of sincerity. This annoyed Jack. Downstairs some more furniture rumbled. Claire shouldn't move heavy things. She was 6 months pregnant. It would be their third. Now Jack was getting really annoyed because Joe was interrupting him a lot, questioning him, and even correcting him. And when Joe made the crying face again, but this time without a trace of sincerity. Without a trace of sincerity means she was faking it. She was faking it. So when Joe made the crying face again, but this time without a trace of sincerity. This annoyed Jack even more. Some more furniture rumbled downstairs, and Jack thought that his wife Claire shouldn't move heavy things. He was worried because she was 6 months pregnant, and he was in a haste to go downstairs and help her paint the woodwork in the living room. But little Joe was just not falling asleep, and he continued with the story. So the wizard says, "Oh, very well. Go to the end of the lane and turn around 3 times and look down the magic well, and there you will find 3 pennies. Hurry up." So Roger Skunk went to the end of the lane and turned around 3 times, and there in the magic well were 3 pennies. So he took them back to the wizard and was very happy, and ran out into the woods, and all the other little animals gathered around him because he smelled so good, and they played tag, baseball, football, basketball, lacrosse, hockey, soccer, and pick up sticks. What's pick up sticks? It's a game you play with sticks, like the wizard's magic wand, kind of. And they played games and laughed all afternoon, and then it began to get dark, and they all ran home to their mommies. June was starting to fuss with her hands and look out of the window at the crack of day that showed under the shade. She thought the story was all over. Jack didn't like women when they took anything for granted. He liked them apprehensive, hanging on his words. Now, Joe, are you listening? Yes, because this is very interesting. Roger Skunk's mommy said, "What's that awful smell?" What? And Roger Skunk said, "It's me, Mommy. I smell like roses." And she said, "Who made you smell like that?" And he said, "The wizard." And she said, "Well, of all the nerve, you come with me, and we are going right back to that very awful wizard." Jo sat up, her hands dabbling in the air with genuine fright. "But, Daddy," then he said about the other little animals run away, her hands scuttered off into the underbrush. "All right," he said, "but, Mommy, all the other little animals run away." And she said, "I don't care. You smelled the way a little skunk should have, and I'm going to take you right back to that wizard." And she took an umbrella and went back with Roger Skunk and hit that wizard right over the head. "No," Jo said, and put her hand out to touch his lips, yet even in her agitation did not quite dare to stop the source of truth. Inspiration came to her. Then the wizard hit her on the head and did not change that little skunk back. Now Jo did not want the wizard to change the smell of Roger Skunk. So she stopped Jack from continuing the story by putting her hand on his lips and blurting out, "Then the wizard hit her on the head and did not change that little skunk back." "No," he said. The wizard said okay, and Roger Skunk did not smell of roses any more. He smelled very bad again. "But the other little animals, Joanne, it's Daddy's story. Shall Daddy not tell you any more stories?" Her broad face looked at him through sifted light, astounded. This is what happened then. Roger Skunk and his mommy went home, and they heard the train bringing Daddy Skunk home from Boston. And they had lima beans, celery, liver, mashed potatoes, and pie, oh my, for dessert. And when Roger Skunk was in bed, Mommy Skunk came up and hugged him and said, He smelled like a little baby skunk again, and she loved him very much. And that's the end of the story. But, Daddy, what? Then did the other little animals run away? No, because eventually they got used to the way he was and did not mind it at all. What's eventuality? In a little while. That was a stupid, Mommy. It was not, he said with a rare emphasis, and believed from her expression that she realized he was defending his own mother to her, or something as odd. Now I want you to put your big heavy head in the pillow and have a good long nap. He adjusted the shade so not even a crack of day showed, and tiptoed to the door, in the pretense that she was already asleep. But when he turned, she was crouching on top of the covers and staring at him. Hey, get under the covers and fall fast asleep. Bobby's asleep. She stood up and bounced gingerly on the springs. Daddy, what? Tomorrow, I want you to tell me the story that wizard took that magic wand and hit that mommy. Her plump arms chopped forcefully right over the head. Jill was not at all satisfied with the way the story had ended. She insisted that Jack tell her the story the next day with a different ending, that it was the wizard who took the magic wand and hit that mommy right over the head. No, that's not the story. The point is that the little skunk loved his mommy more than he loved all the other little animals, and she knew what was right. No, tomorrow you say, he hit that mommy. Do it. She kicked her legs up and sat down on the bed with a great heave and complained of springs as she had done hundreds of times before. Except that this time she did not laugh. Say it, Daddy. Well, we'll see. Now at least have a rest. Stay on the bed. You are a good girl. He closed the door and went downstairs. Claire had spread the newspapers and opened the paint can, and wearing an old shirt of his on top of her maternity smock, was stroking the chair rail with a dipped brush. Above him, footsteps vibrated, and he called, Joanne, shall I come up there and spank you? The footsteps hesitated. That was a long story, Claire said. The poor kid, he answered, and with utter weariness watched his wife labor. The woodwork, a cage of mouldings, and rails and baseboards all around them, was half old tan and half new ivory, and he felt caught in an ugly middle position. And though he as well felt his wife's presence in the cage with him, he did not want to speak with her, work with her, touch her, anything. The most important phrase in the entire chapter is that he felt caught in an ugly middle position. If you've understood this phrase, you've understood the whole chapter. Being caught in an ugly middle position means being caught in a difficult or a bad situation. Although Jack was conscious of his duties as a father and as a husband and wanted to fulfill both the duties, he could not even perform one of his duties properly. His efforts to make Joe fall asleep proved quite tiring because Joe kept on interrupting him, asking for clarifications, pointing out errors, and suggesting alternatives. This took more time than expected to end the story. And when Jack felt that Joe thought that the story was over, he deliberately continued the story because he didn't like women when they took anything for granted. He liked them apprehensive. So he continued the story further, even though he was in a haste to go downstairs and help his pregnant wife with the woodwork painting. The result of the extension to the story proved quite unfruitful and unpleasant for all three of them. Nor Joe was happy with the story, nor his wife was pleased, and complained that it was a long story, and Jack himself was thoroughly worn out. He wanted to help his wife, but he was thoroughly tired. He did not feel like speaking with her or working with her, and watched everything with utter weariness. So that's the end of the story, and we'll do some important questions. The rest I might give in the PDF format. So let us start with the first question. Let us start with the first question. What is the moral issue that the story raises? The story raises the moral issue that should parents always take decisions for their children or let children decide for themselves what is to be done? The author is trying to tell us that the worldview of a little child is quite different from an adult's perspective on life. Jack, the father, defends the behavior of Roger Skunk's mother and sums up the issue by saying that she knew what was right for him. As to why the little skunk agreed to his mother's decision, Jack says that he loved his mommy more than he loved all the other little animals. And he even cites an instance that when Roger Skunk was in bed, Mother Skunk came up and hugged him and said that he smelled like his little baby skunk again, and she loved him very much. But little Joe does not agree to her father's point of view. She feels that Mother Skunk should not have robbed the pleasure of her little son and should not have deprived him of the pleasant smell of the roses. She insisted that the wizard hit the mommy skunk on the head and not change that little skunk back. And she even called the little skunk's mommy a stupid mommy. Until the end, she stuck to her viewpoint, and she kept insisting that her father tell her the story the next day with a different ending, that it was the wizard who hit that mommy and not change that little skunk back. Why does Jack insist that it was the wizard that was hit and not the mother? Jack has the typical parental attitude. He feels that parents know what is best for their children. He asserts the parental authority time and time again by quietening Jo and stifling her objections while narrating the story. He defends the behavior of Roger Skunk's mother and says that she wanted the little skunk to smell the way a little skunk should. She did not want him to carry an artificial or uncharacteristic smell of roses, and she knew what was right for him. Secondly, the little skunk loved his mommy more than he loved all the other little animals. That's why he took his mom to the wizard and did not mind it at all when the wizard restored the original foul smell back to him. Jack insisted on this ending to emphasize the love and concern of parents for their children. What is your stance regarding to the two endings to the Roger Skunk story? Of the two endings to the Roger Skunk story, the story narrated by Jack that Mommy Skunk hit the wizard on the head and asked him to restore the original foul smell back to Roger's skunk is more realistic. Every species of animals has its special features. She wanted that the little skunk should smell the way a little skunk should. He should not carry an artificial or deceptive smell of the roses. And she knew what was right for him. Secondly, the little skunk loved his mommy more than he loved all the other little animals. That's why he did not mind it at all when the wizard restored back the original foul smell back. And eventually, all the other little animals got used to the smell of the little skunk and did not mind it at all. Of course, it took them some time to get used to the smell, but they got used to it and did not mind it at all. And Jack does not agree with Joe's remark that Roger Skunk's mommy was a stupid mommy. In fact, he defends Mommy Skunk's behavior and sums up the issue by saying that she knew what was right for him. He even cites an instance that when Roger Skunk was in bed, Mommy Skunk came up and hugged him and said that he smelled like his little baby skunk again, and she loved him very much. In fact, we find her a very loving and caring mother. Jack's version of story brings out the mother's love, care, and concern for her little baby. Who is Jo and how does she respond to her father's storytelling? Jo was the 4-year-old daughter of Jack and Claire, and for the last 2 years, Jack, her father, had been telling her stories. Since all the stories were woven around the same basic tale and had the same characters and turn of events, Jo took many things for granted and actively participated in her father's storytelling session. She took keen interest in her father's storytelling, and she had deep adoration for all the characters in the story, be it the wise old owl or the old wizard and the other little creatures in the woodland, and of course, the main character, usually named Roger. In fact, so complete was her identification with the main character that she seemed to share his pleasure or pain. So she thoroughly used to enjoy the storytelling session. Why does Roger Skunk's mommy got angry? Does her anger seem justified? Roger Skunk's mommy was angry because he had lost his original smell he was born with. She wanted that the little skunk should smell the way a little skunk should. She did not want him to carry an artificial or uncharacteristic smell of roses. This original foul smell was a God given protection against danger to keep the predators at bay. This newly acquired smell of roses, however pleasant and sweet smelling, could endanger the little skunk's life. Her anger seems justified because by this simple act, the wizard had put little skunk's life in danger, and no mother can act peacefully or rationally when there is some danger to the young one. So she asks Roger Skunk to take her right back to that wizard and asks him to restore the original smell back so that he is free of any dangers. Why is an adult's perspective on life different from that of a child's? An adult's perspective on life is different from that of a child's because of the difference between their respective experiences and exposure to the world around them. An adult comes across all sorts of experiences, good or bad, happy or sad, pleasant or unpleasant, encouraging or discouraging. But a child lives a sheltered life under the protection and love of his parents. In a beautiful world of a child's imagination, fairies and wizards are more real than the reality itself. They hero worship their characters, like little Joe had a deep regard for the old wizard because he had magical powers and he could do anything. She did not want that a wizard should change the smell of the little skunk because she felt that the other little animals would run away and won't play with him. She was not at all convinced that the other little animals eventually got used to the smell of the little skunk and did not mind it at all. And not only Joe, most of the children lack the quality of accepting the reality. But over a period of time, when they grow up and become mature, they are able to take things the way they are with a pinch of salt. How does Joe want the story to end and why? The little Joe wanted the story to end in a different way. She wanted that the old wizard should hit that mommy right on the head and not change that little skunk back. Little Joe could not digest the fact that the wizard agreed to Mommy Skunk's decision of restoring the original foul smell back to Roger Skunk. She had a deep regard for the old wizard because he had magical powers and he could do anything. She wanted that the old wizard should not change the smell of the little skunk because she felt that the other little animals would again run away and won't play with him. She was not at all convinced that the other little animals eventually got used to the smell of the little skunk and did not mind it at all. She kept on insisting that her father tell her the story the next day with a different ending, that it was the wizard who hit that mommy on the head and did not change that little skunk back. What do you think was Joe's problem? Joe had been accustomed to the happy endings of the stories. At the request of the little skunk, the old wizard agreed to change that awful smell to that of the roses. Roger Skunk was extremely happy and he ran out into the woods, and all the other little animals gathered around him because he smelled so good. They played many games, had fun, laughed all afternoon, and when it began to get dark, all of them ran back home to their mommies. Joe could not digest the fact that Mommy Skunk hit that wizard right on the head and forced him to restore the original foul smell back to Roger Skunk. She wanted that the old wizard should not change the smell of the little skunk because she felt that the other little animals would run away and won't play with him. She wanted that the wizard should hit that unreasonable mommy right on the head and leave the little skunk emitting the pleasant smell of the roses. She was not at all convinced that eventually the other little animals got used to the smell of the little skunk and did not mind it at all. She kept on insisting that her father tell her the story the next day, that it was the wizard who hit that mommy and not change that little skunk back. What makes Jack feel caught in an ugly middle position? Jack was conscious of his duties as a father and as a husband. His efforts to make Jo fall asleep proved quite tiring. She kept on interrupting him, asking for clarifications, pointing out errors, and suggesting alternatives. Jack did not like that women should take anything for granted. He liked them to be apprehensive, so he extended the story further, though he was in a haste to go downstairs and help his pregnant wife in her hard work of painting the woodwork. The result of the extension to the story proved quite unfruitful and unpleasant for all three of them. Joe wanted him to change the ending of the story. Claire, his wife, complained that he had told a long story. Jack felt utter weariness. The woodwork, a cage of mouldings and rails, and baseboards all around them, was half old tan and half new ivory, and he felt caught in an ugly middle position, physically, emotionally, and mentally.